Hi, I'm Jo Bond, and I organised this meeting because I'm concerned about the level of funding for Radio New Zealand. They've been operating under a 9-year funding freeze, and they've got a media blackout around it, where they are limited in how much they can report about it themselves, and other news outlets won't let their journalists print the stories or broadcast the stories quite often, either because they're commercially in competition with them or because they're also funded by New Zealand On Air. So it's a serious problem and it's hard to get the message out. Okay, today I've got a guest panellist, Gareth Hughes, Member of Parliament for the Greens. He's their broadcasting spokesperson. He does a fantastic job, in my opinion, and I look forward to hearing about the Green Party's policy. I have apologies from Dr. Brett Nichols, Dr. Anne Begg, Dr. Hugh Slotin, Dr. Graham Downs, Dr. Anthony Ritchie, Associate Professor Robert Burns, Tracy Martin, Member of Parliament for New Zealand First, who's the broadcasting spokesperson, Right Honourable Winston Peters, Te Ururoa Flavel, Marama Fox, David Seymour and Chris Farfoy. Oh, and also Claire Curran, who's the Labour spokesperson for broadcasting. I'd just like to read out Tracy Martin's written a statement in lieu of being able to be here. Message for RNZ protest meeting in Dunedin from Tracy Martin, New Zealand First spokesperson for broadcasting. Firstly, can I thank Jo for offering to read this message out and express my sincere apologies for not being able to join you today. Please do not take this for any lack of enthusiasm on the part of New Zealand First. We are passionate about public broadcasting and working with the Coalition for Better Broadcasting and others, and intend to head into the 2017 general election with a well-rounded, solid broadcasting policy that would once again give New Zealanders access to high quality, independent reporting and programming that they deserve as a first world nation. It has been fascinating for the last 6 years to sit in Parliament and listen to the government members stand and argue how much they believe in public broadcasting and how much they believe that this institution should remain and should be well funded. This government has dragged its heels for 6 long years over Radio New Zealand Amendment Bill, holding up the development of a charter so desperately needed to gain funding. They only finally moved to pass that legislation once they had beaten Radio New Zealand into submission and gained any agreement not to ask for any increase in funding. So the message to Radio New Zealand and those of us in New Zealand who believe in public broadcasting, do not look to the national-led government to fund public broadcasting appropriately. They will talk the talk in the middle of the night. They will talk the talk, but they will not walk the walk. For going on 9 years, this essential service, our trusted voice, not only here in New Zealand, but around the Pacific, has lacked the funding it needs to pay for its broadcasters appropriately, to develop the digital platforms the government is so keen on, to develop new programming for both us and our Pacific neighbours. Like many others, this government has bullied Radio New Zealand with threats and inaction to the point where they have removed their funding requests. Well, the time of being afraid of a national government selling off is coming to a close. Because let's get real, this government hates public broadcasting. Privatisation is in its bones. But their time is nearly up. A New Zealand First-led government understands the vital role of public broadcasting and will fund it accordingly. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I wish you well in your endeavours. Tracy Martin, New Zealand First spokesperson for broadcasting. I will hand you over now to Gareth Hughes. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Jo. Well, kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. It's absolutely wonderful to be here with you all today. It's amazing to see such a large turnout. I guess I should start by saying Happy Anniversary Day. Hope you're enjoying it, and thanks all so much for coming out. It's really important what we're discussing today. And Jo, on behalf of the people of New Zealand, thank you for your absolutely relentless work. You know, Radio New Zealand, it is a taonga, a treasure for New Zealand. I don't know if you're like me, but do you wake up every morning to the sound of Guyon and Susie and wake up every Saturday to the sounds of Kim Hill? This year, we're also going to see the 50th anniversary of Checkpoint. And I love, cooking dinner for my family, listening to John Campbell, grill the decision makers, the news makers of the day, and getting informed about what's happening to our country. Public broadcasting in any country is critically important. In a small country like New Zealand with a relatively small population, we've got to realise that no one else is going to tell our stories. The big overseas corporates. If we want to see New Zealanders on our screens or on our radios, if we want to see those stories, hear our news, we have to do it ourselves. And unlike most developed countries in the OECD, we don't have a public broadcaster on TV. Now, it's a statutory fact that Television New Zealand is not a public broadcaster, but if you just turn it on, you realise that pretty fast with a relentless diet of reality shows, and Māori TV does some fantastic work, but they play a specialised role in our country. They're a Māori broadcaster, keeping te reo, that taonga, alive. We do not have a public broadcaster on television. We did, remember, only a few years ago when we had Channel 7. Which unfortunately was scrapped by the national government. Now, it was good to hear Tracy Martin's comments from New Zealand First. I'm not going to get as political as her, but maybe in the discussions we can ask some of the questions why we've seen such a systemic underfunding, a scrapping of public broadcasting on TV. And I'll give you the answer. It is ideological. We have a government ideologically opposed to public broadcasting. But this meeting that Joe's called is around Radio New Zealand, now known as RNZ, so I'll keep my comments to that. I guess to start though, we need to put it in the bigger picture. I was recently reading a report which analysed the OECD developed countries. We spend 4 times less than the developed world on public broadcasting, considerably less than Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada. Only the United States is behind us in terms of the per capita, the per person spend. We spend 4 times less. And as Joe pointed out, we've had a funding freeze at RNZ since 2008. Now, I remember back in 2007, KPMG, the independent experts, were brought in to analyse RNZ's books, look at the Crown funding to this Crown entity, and what they found was, even back in 2007, RNZ was under a funding shortfall, they estimated at the time about $17 million. What we've seen, though, since 2008, and that relentless funding freeze, is a real-term funding cut, once inflation has been taken into effect, of $3.3 million. Last year, we saw 47 staff, out of a relatively small staff of only slightly more than 300, laid off. 47 staff in a single year. Last year, Radio New Zealand ran a deficit of $4.7 million. Often when it comes to these issues, it is a question of funding, and when it comes to the government, questioning their funding priorities. We saw a $4.7 million deficit last year. This is on previous deficits. Also, what we're now seeing is their Auckland building's up for sale. That's estimated to net around $50 million. Guess where that money's going to go? It ain't going to RNZ, it's going directly into the Crown books. So here you see a funding freeze, staff being laid off, assets sold, and they're not being returned into that core business. Now, I want to celebrate the work they do. All journalists in New Zealand, and I'm privileged, part of my position, I get to work with a lot of journalists day to day. They're all doing it for the right reasons. They're trying to get information out. But there's a critical role for a national broadcaster, a public broadcaster, with no advertising on air, no corporate pressures to make sure they maximise the clicks or produce clickbait. So this isn't a criticism of the rest of the journalists in New Zealand, but I think it's important to identify, as almost every other developed nation does, there is a specialised, important role for a public broadcaster. So I also, as part of my job, get to play a financial oversight role through the Commerce Select Committee in Parliament. Last year, when I was questioning the CEO of RNZ, I thought it was an astounding statement, but I asked, why haven't you put in a funding bid for last year's budget? And you know what he told me? He told me it's like hitting your head against a brick wall. That's a direct quote. He said it was like hitting your head against a brick wall trying to get money out of the government for the funding bid. This year, when I asked the same question, they're anticipating, and I think it's fantastic they are, putting in a funding bid to the government. They are going to be asking for extra money. I think that's only prudent when you're running a $4.7 million deficit. But he also said that they're at real risk of stalling. They've seen some momentum. They've started new shows, new platforms like The Wireless, which is targeting younger New Zealanders with mostly online content. And he said there is a real risk of stalling. So I've been questioning the government in question time, and I asked Bill English in the aftermath of the Kaikoura earthquakes, when they really showed what an important role they play, particularly in natural disasters. I remember, waking up, not thrown out of bed, but I jumped out of bed to see if my kids were all right after that big shake. And the first thing you do is, turn to Twitter, turn on the radio to find out what's happening. And the absolute call that broadcaster showed when it was literally shaking, but she stayed on the air to keep the updates, I thought was incredibly impressive. And they did such a fantastic role. And if anything, it highlighted it. So I asked Bill English, given the important role they play, they're the agency we turn to in times of natural disaster, will they get a funding increase in the next budget? The good news is he did keep the door open a little bit. So I haven't held my breath for 8 years, but I'm optimistic that given those funding pressures are now so tight that we will see a likely increase in the budget. But I guess to keep it political, as Tracy did, my message to you would be, even if we get a token funding increase in this budget, that's because of the work of activists like you, the Campaign for Better Broadcasting, the hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders who are calling out for high quality public broadcasting. It is a victory for us, but there has been and still will be an ideological opposition. So if you value public broadcasting in New Zealand, make sure you value those parties who support public broadcasting, their policies. I'll be making an announcement in a couple of weeks about the Green Party's position. But let me say this is the final word. We've been relentless supporters of public broadcasting in New Zealand, be it when TVNZ still once upon a time had a public charter, standing up for that, standing up for Channel 7 before that was disestablished, and relentlessly calling for adequate funding for RNZ. So you have our support. The Green Party will continue to support that. It's an amazing service. It is a taonga, and I'd like to thank you all for turning out, and Joe, for your work on this area. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was Gareth Hughes, broadcasting spokesperson for the Green Party. Right. So there's a few other issues that are going along with the funding freeze. Last August, Radio New Zealand had to not replace its old AM transmitter that was broadcasting out over the South Pacific. Now they've got one that broadcasts out both on digital and analogue, but this one was broadcasting purely on analogue. And the one that's broadcasting out on digital only broadcasts out on the pure analogue at certain times of the day instead of all the time. They do switch it over for emergencies, but what that means is that there are many people who cannot get the internet, they cannot get FM radio, and they cannot get digital shortwave, so they're missing out on vital news. And also, there's the language problem. Radio New Zealand wanted to broadcast out more programs in Pacific languages, but unfortunately, due to the funding freeze, they're pretty much mostly broadcasting in English. They're not able to expand their range of languages and increase the amount of programs in Pacific languages, which I think is a travesty to the people of the Pacific, especially given with westernisation that many Pacific languages are in danger, particularly Niuean. Most Niuean people actually live in New Zealand, not in Niue. So we want to do all that we can to actually preserve the Pacific cultures and the Pacific languages so that their children and their children's children are not anglicised to the point where they not able to speak their own language. It would be incredibly sad. Another issue is that for Radio New Zealand drama, they've had to actually reduce their number of writers that they hire, the number of actors that they hire, and the amount of work that they can produce because of the funding freeze as well. That's all those potential actors and writers, people that could cut their teeth there or even earn a living there and then go on to develop their careers, are not getting that opportunity anymore. It is really sad. There have been mass redundancies over the years in RNZ Concert. At one point it was like there was a farewell party every week. And a lot of those people were encouraged into early retirement, nicely, because they were getting a bit older. But they weren't so old that they needed to retire. It was just about saving money. And these are people with the institutional knowledge and the skills in analogue radio. And that is a travesty to actually lose that. Not everyone can access the internet, even in New Zealand. There are actually parts of New Zealand that can only get AM radio. They can't get the internet, they can't get FM radio as well. So you actually want to... Last year they were actually considering selling the transmission sites for the AM transmitters in New Zealand, just to get some more money. Other stations actually rent space on those transmitters too, so that's a drop in their income. Now, without AM, sufficient coverage, and I know there's not coverage all over the country, there are people who will miss out. They are farmers, people who work in the bush, truck drivers. And also say that Radio New Zealand is really important to the elderly. Many elderly people use the radio for comfort, especially widows. Some actually have the radio under their pillow to help them sleep. I mean, the elderly are quite a diverse range. There are people who are quite good on the internet. There are some who can only use email, and there are some who don't want to go near a computer. They tend to be quite older, but... So their main form of information is the radio and it is the television. But given the way that television news is going, I know there's some good journalism in television, but in general, it's going downhill. I actually think that Radio New Zealand is vitally important for high-quality, impartial journalism that's not beholden to shareholders or advertisers. It's actually works to a charter that's supposed to serve us. And they do try to actually produce content that is for the public good, and they're largely succeeding. They're also incredibly popular. Last year, the government disestablished the broadcasting portfolio, last December, in their reshuffle. We no longer have a Minister of Broadcasting. They split the broadcasting portfolio between arts, culture and heritage and communications. I see communications as being like infrastructure, internet, broadband, that kind of thing. And arts, culture and heritage is the arts. But I'm wondering how much of what Radio New Zealand has will fall through the cracks. That if it doesn't neatly fit into arts, culture and heritage and to infrastructure, and dividing it up, what will be missing that won't be picked up? And also think that it reduces accountability. If you actually have no Minister of Broadcasting, then that actually takes away the importance of broadcasting. It's similar to what they did with the housing portfolio, where they actually split it up into social housing. And social housing, by the way, is not state housing, it's actually private social housing. That's the definition of it, apparently. So I'm really concerned about the future of Radio New Zealand. What I would like to do is actually hold more public meetings, preferably with Gareth as one of the speakers because he's amazing, and get the word out there, because it's not going to get out there through the mainstream media. I encourage you to tell people about this, let people know that there's a huge problem, write to your MP, or you could always try writing to Simon Bridges and Maggie Barry, who are now the broadcasting people, along with Stephen Joyce, who does finance, and tell them that you're not impressed that our public broadcaster has had the same funding for the past 9 years. They've had to cut staff, they've had to sell assets, buildings, and cut programs. A lot of people have said to me that they're not impressed with the watered down content, especially on RNZ Concert. Well, that's because they don't have enough money to keep the status quo. If they had more money, they could do more things and they could go back to doing more in-depth things. Does anyone remember Spectrum? Rest in peace, Spectrum. Rest in peace. And rest in peace, public broadcasting. I would like to hand it over to the floor now. Does anyone have any questions for me or Gareth? Jared.
Just a small point I think is important, is just on the side here. The AM frequency is got a better range of spectral sound, for hearing, for dialogue, information content. That's quite important. I mean, the FM radios have a different setting, which is good for music, but not for information content. So, just aside. You made the comment about that ideological stance, which is behind some of these moves. The other way to look at it is to try to move into a more informed opposition to cutting of public broadcasting. And that is to talk about the actual data on what it's providing, which is not provided elsewhere, to get more hard-nosed. The excellent work by Joe Atkinson over decades, where he tracked the change, the devolution of the media, and the change in the content of news broadcasts, the tracking in TV, breaking it up to segments and measuring the amount which is put on trivia, amount on celebrity, amount on genuine news, etc. Give you good hard facts on the way it's changing. That needs to be put together to contrast with what goes on in the media now, especially in the television, where the quality, the amount of news and the perspective of the news has changed immeasurably and be put into a commentary framework, especially with Mike Hosking, which is very distorting and delusional mostly. So that needs to be documented and attacked clearly, and rather than just sitting around and lamenting it. The other great source, I think the Media Watch does superb work in analysing the contrast between the quality of journalism and reporting on the main commercial media and Radio New Zealand, which stands out again and again above all the rest. Need that hard information to say to the government, this is what it's providing, this is the role of it, this is what's not being happening in the private domain, so we can go the next step and make them accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. Would you like to respond, or you?
Can you hear me?
Can't hear you.
Well, I think that's a fair point, Jared, and I agree with you. The data does exist, and I know academics are collecting it, the Campaign for Better Broadcasting are collecting it. I think it's also pretty self-evident as well when you flick between the radio channels, as it were. Recently we saw the Broadcasting Standards Authority issue a case on Mike Hoskins in particular, and some of his comments around, I think it was the Māori seats in the New Plymouth District Council. And basically they found that inaccurate comments were made, but because it was in the guise of commentary, it was entirely fine. So there was no case to proceed with. But I don't think that's what we want to see, particularly on a state broadcaster, even if we acknowledge it's not a public broadcaster. Now, I know RNZ in particular has been criticised in recent years for the Māori content. I know Willie Jackson was pretty prominent on that last year. And the Select Committee has been presented with a lot of data and metrics, how that's improved. So I really want to acknowledge and congratulate that work. You've got some great people like Mahina Rangi Forbes on RNZ now doing some great reporting, which is great. On the flip side, we've also lost some specialised science reporting. The Veronica Maduna's work on RNZ was the only dedicated weekly science show in New Zealand, which unfortunately was scrapped, and we actually ran a petition, which I think had about 5,000 people, which we sent off to the government. And I guess that's part of the bigger trend that we've seen in New Zealand. All media in New Zealand are facing considerable stresses from new technology, the way people are consuming information. Sorry? And newspapers, absolutely. We're seeing that with the potential, I call it the mega media merger, which is between Fairfax, which is the Stuff website, and the Fairfax papers, and the New Zealand Herald. So two of our biggest news websites potentially merging. That's in front of the Commerce Commission at the moment. And what we could see effectively is a single daily newspaper for all of our major metropolitan and provincial towns, a single potential news website. So greater media consolidation. And that's exactly what we've seen over the preceding decades, is much less diversity in media ownership. Now, you rightfully have been quite proud in Dunedin because of your independent ODT. I'm from Gisborne, it's where I grew up and where I'm standing this election. We're the only other city in New Zealand with an independent-owned newspaper, the Gisborne Herald. But that's been very much against the trend. So, yeah, I think that data is there. It's incumbent on us to keep collecting it. I think those arguments can be made. I'd still say it's ideological, though. When you look at the track records, pet projects, be it Sky City or smelters, get almost unlimited funding. 30 million in the case of the smelter, casino licenses for the Sky City deal, yet it's the public broadcasters that have seen cuts as Channel 7 or real term funding cuts as RNZ. Just lastly, if I can pick up on your point about the broadcasting minister, it was kind of a ridiculous situation at the select committee. We couldn't work out who the actual minister responsible was, which I find incredible. Recently, we saw, about 5 years ago, a similar situation arise with the National Library. Previously, the National Librarian directly reported to the minister responsible and could brief him or her about what was happening and some of the pressures there. Because the Department of Internal Affairs then took over the National Library, now the National Librarian is a fourth-tier official who can't brief the minister directly. So what you see is a lack of focus, a lack of that direct interaction, and I don't want to see that happen with public broadcasting. That's why I'm very much opposed to the disestablishment of the broadcasting portfolio.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any questions? Or comments?
Just a quick observation. I'm Jim O'Malley. I'm one of your new councillors, and I still find myself introducing myself to the audience because people don't really know who I am yet. It's good to see everybody here. How many of you were here in the Octagon on Saturday for the Cadbury's protest? Because a few are, and I think one of the things that I'd like to bring forward to people's consciousness is that this is a symptomatic issue which goes across the whole of society. Currently we're fighting for making sure that the hospital ends up being in an appropriate place for the city and it isn't picked by Treasury as to where it's going to go. And so what I encourage you to do is not only fight this fight, because this is an incredibly important fight, because in many respects the central theme of good democracy is a well-informed voter. And in some respects, while it may not be a deliberate policy to kill Radio New Zealand, although, look at Solid Energy being run into the ground and in the end now basically going to have to be sold off. It could be a deliberate policy, but regardless of whether it is or not, without an institution like Radio New Zealand there, the voters themselves are now being biased on how to interpret, how to make their decision. And that in effect entrenches a way of thinking which I think New Zealand's ready to reject now. And I think we're ready to go back to a path that we were on years ago before it got taken from us. And in order for us to get back on that path, we must turn up to every one of these events, not just the one that you're interested in, because our numbers are the only thing that really influences. And this year's an election year, so any time that we're called out to go to anything, I'm just asking all of you, always turn out to all of them. Thanks.
Thank you. Wonderful. Here you go.
How effective are the petitions? Do you get to find out?
I actually handed this petition over last year and it wasn't presented by the MP who accepted it. What I will say with this petition is that I had always had it in my head that if it was handed over, they wouldn't hold my breath that the government would go, oh goody, and change everything. I thought that it would go through select committee and people could make submissions. But the purpose of this petition is not so much the petition, is to actually spread the information about it. By growing the petition, it's actually just a vehicle to get people aware. You go up, you get someone to sign it, you have a dialogue with them about the issue of the funding freeze. More than 9 out of 10 people who listen to RNZ have no idea there is a funding freeze. So the petition was actually a vehicle for me to raise awareness, basically, as are these meetings. So I don't consider the petition on its own to be effective. It's just the vehicle to move things forward. Does that answer your question? Would you like to, or you fine? Okay.
Well, I just add too from personal reflection that I've been on select committees where we've had thousands of submissions, 99.9% saying one thing, and it was absolutely disregarded if the government's got a majority on the select committee. So I agree with your point that it's an awareness-raising issue, it's a mobilisation tool, but ultimately if the government has an interest in opposing it, they'll they'll do it. It's part of our old-fashioned petition and submission rules in New Zealand that they aren't given adequate weight. But look, there is a fantastic movement for it. I think that's why Bill English didn't shut the door on a funding increase when I was questioning him, because he's seeing the petitions. I know Action Station, the online campaigning group, had a petition as well, which I don't know the numbers, but I think that was fairly large as well. So momentum's growing, and if I was a betting person, I'd bet money that we will see a small funding increase, particularly because the Crown's going to get this $50 million injection from selling off the asset in Auckland, which won't make up for it. But again, I think the issue isn't just a one-off funding increase. We've seen 9 years of inflation leading to a real-term funding cut. What you actually want to have is a sustained funding so they can do what they want to do. You raised the issue of the Pacific. Earlier this year, the ABC literally and very abruptly decided, that's it, we're pulling out. So the chief exec told the select committee, look, there's a potential doubling of our audience of another 2 million listeners if we can extend our reach, which is currently only shortwave, but extend the provision of services out to the Pacific. So there's fantastic growth opportunities, and particularly what they're doing with new media, you know, streaming Checkpoint live to the internet, what they're doing with the wireless. There's definitely room to grow, and I absolutely agree with your comments, Councillor, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to acknowledge you earlier.
I'm really sorry. Welcome, Jim O'Malley. No, I know. Anyone else got any comments? Okay. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, just acknowledging the guest speakers. Welcome, Gareth, and welcome, Jim, and everyone else. The thought I've got, just reflecting on it, just as a grassroots New Zealand voter, you know, like there'd be a lot of people in New Zealand who listen to RNZ and you know, and value it. So I'm sort of thinking, is there any case for an appeal to human rights law? There's a book that was released last year by Judy McGregor, Sylvia Bell, and one other person, Margaret Wilson, they're all with a legal background. And they talk about the role of the Bill of Rights and the difference between the UN Charter and the two different streams that the human rights goes into. The IESCR, the Covenant of Economic Social Rights, and the ICCPR, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, one of these has got more attention by Parliament than the other one, but my question is, you know, is there a chance for an appeal for extra resourcing to RNZ and public broadcasting under these statutes, or affiliations with that law for the sake of the commons and and public broadcasting?
Thank you, Sean. Would you like to take this, or should I take this first? Or
I don't know the answer. It's a very interesting idea, though.
Yeah, it is. I'm sure it's something that you'll follow up, won't it, you? Anyone else got any questions? Okay, I'll go Gail, and then I'll go the lovely man in the green shirt.
Thanks, Joe. It's just a quick question. Joe, the building in Auckland that RNZ is selling, so Gareth said 50 million that it would be worth. So after that, what do they do? Is this the one they currently work from, or will they be paying a massive rent per square metre, Thank you.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Because we know what Auckland rents are like, don't we? I've been thinking about this. First, you've got the problem is they could charge a heap for the CBD, especially something that's kitted out as a studio. And where are they going to go? So they're at the mercy of the landlord, who has even more power because it's already kitted out and they can't afford to go anywhere else. And then they've got to have a landlord that's actually willing to rent back to them, because, they might say, oh no, I want to turn this into a hotel. So I can't imagine that that's going to be very good for their coffers as well, with the huge amount of rents. That's going to send them into the poorhouse even quicker. Do you have anything to add?
Just to say that figure I quoted, 50 million, is just an estimate. It's going through the sale process at the moment, so a figure hasn't been publicly disclosed yet. It's anticipated to be settled by April, but statements have been made publicly that that funding would go directly to the Crown. So,
Thank you. I'm going to green shirt guy now. Hello. What's your name?
William.
William.
Hi guys, I'm William. So I guess I'd just like to say 3 things. So I guess in modern times, a lot of issues are coming up in the political world, and I guess we're struggling to have a great lives, or in some sense that the housing's going, radio's going, it's sort of just everything isn't as qualitised as what it used to be or it could have been. And also another point, I wonder how diverse our broadcasting system is, like sort of student broadcasting, broadcasting about people with disabilities and other type of minorities like that. And yeah, cheers, thanks.
Thank you, William. I'm not sure that our broadcasting can ever be diverse enough at the moment. I struggle, though. There are a lot of invisible disabilities. To name anyone in RNZ who's disabled aside from Wallace Chapman. Oh, that's great. Are you talking about programs about disabled people or? Yeah. Yeah. I don't know their disability statistics, but I do know that they aim to be diverse. They have 48% women employed across the entire organisation, so I'm certain that they must have a positive kind of framework for hiring people with disabilities as well.
Well, I'd just say, yeah, thanks for the good comment, William. Mojo Mathers is one of our MPs. She was New Zealand's first profoundly deaf MP, and she's been a real champion for disability issues. And I wouldn't say the lack of disability diversity in our media is just a media problem. I think it's a wider cultural problem in terms of access, which we sorely lack in New Zealand. In terms of the diversity of opinions, in New Zealand, many of you will remember back when we used to have industrial relations reporters, dedicated education reporters, dedicated beat reporters, which we've seen, so many of, particularly our newspapers provincially, reduce the numbers of local reporters doing a beat. We've seen, sub-editing taken off to Australia, so you see the embarrassing odd gaff come in the newspaper because they didn't understand the local context. And I guess to put it in a wider context, we've seen the access radio stations being severely underfunded as well, and they play a critical role getting those less sort of mainstream ideas or opinions or spokespeople out. So there is a wider media problem in New Zealand. We are seeing some high quality journalism come from some of the traditional media. Matt Nippert late last week launched that incredible investigation that Apple hasn't paid any tax for 10 years in New Zealand, despite billions in income. We're seeing the likes of Nikki Hager, who I think is putting out a new book tomorrow. So there's pockets of investigative journalism, but I think when you look at some of the overseas example, we've got such a tiny number of journalists actually doing that long-term grinding investigative reporting. We have a real issue. Other countries have attempted to deal with it by setting up dedicated public journalism funds. This is something I've been investigating and looking around the world to see how they do it. We've got New Zealand On Air doing a bit of broadcasting. They've only just recently decided they've broadened out into, for example, YouTube content. So we see funding for shows full of eligible bachelors and such forth on TV get tens of millions of dollars, but the independent investigative stuff's really gone by the wayside. So we've got some great examples, don't get me wrong, but we could be doing so much better. So here's one potential solution which has been raised.
I'll also add Julie Woods, who's profoundly blind, also has shows on Radio New Zealand as well. Does anyone else have a question?
Just a comment, which probably sounds a little bit negative after all the positive things people have been saying. I love Radio New Zealand, but one thing that's gone, I think, is the training. Training of announcers, and often the grammar isn't wonderful, and often people's names aren't pronounced properly, and they probably don't have the time or the money or anything to check up some of these things, or not enough staff, but it's certainly noticeable that some of those things have slipped, I think.
I'm actually hearing that a lot. I'm also hearing complaints about profanity being used on RNZ. I'm not sure whether it's because of their desire to appeal to a younger audience, whether they're relaxing things and being less formal, or whether it's something that's slipped under the radar, perhaps with the rejuvenation of the different presenters and the different staff, that maybe the culture's changed inside. So I'm not sure. Anyone else? Hello.
Thank you. Mention of funding from New Zealand On Air. I understood that that was the sort of parent funding body that provided the money from which Radio New Zealand and whatever other recipients got the funds. Do we need also to be chasing New Zealand On Air if that is an actual body, or not just an acronym?
I was making the point that investigative reporting wouldn't be eligible under current NZ On Air funding, and that other countries have broadened the scope of their equivalent funds to include work like that, and I think that's probably a really good idea. Lots of different traditional media can access it, but the things which we're lacking in our media environment, or some of the new media, I gave the YouTube example, are very slowly coming to be able to access those funds.
This is a personal opinion. I don't know why RNZ is in New Zealand On Air, competing, in the platform with all the access radios. Why can't they just give them money? Hello, Scout.
Hey, my name's Scout. Just to add into the weight of the debate, especially down in Otago and Southland, so we've got, from my last count, only one Otago Southland reporter from RNZ. That's in addition to TVNZ having very few reporters down here. Even News Hub have very few reporters down here. We're facing a media blackout in the Deep South if we can't do something about the fact that we've got no one reporting other than the ODT, who are doing a really fantastic job, but we need more, and we need more diversity in our media in terms of different media outlets being able to have a say and not this monopoly.
Yeah, they closed the Queenstown office last year, RNZ, so they've no longer got that. They also closed two other ones very recently. They were actually they weren't actually open for that many years, believe it or not.
I also like to just mention about the Sky TV branch office. Was that closed last year? And I remember also the Sky TV was happening with trying to match up with Vodafone, but I think that deal fell through. I don't know. Yeah, cheers.
Thank you. Has anyone else got a comment? Okay.
I've just got it's not humorous, but a personal reflection. There's a controversial hydropower proposal on the west coast, and I'd arranged a helicopter to take us up to view the site, one of our last pristine wild rivers. I approached both TV channels to say, look, free helicopter ride, you'll get some great footage. Neither of them could get reporters to the west coast at all, so it just couldn't happen. So I missed out on my helicopter trip, unfortunately. But you're right, the Sky Vodafone merger wasn't approved by the Commerce Commission, but we're seeing incredible flux, and all the players are jockeying for relationships and the sort of new environment to compete. And it raises the issue of Sky TV in particular. Yeah, again, that less diversity of ownership and perspectives. But Sky, for example, there's very little New Zealand content, full stop. If you took out sport, I think you could probably count it on one hand the amount of local content. And they haven't contributed to some of the wider funds, which other media players in New Zealand haven't have as well in the past. So I know there's been a traditional issue with Sky and the lack of sort of contributing to New Zealand.
Hello, William.
Because I guess that Sky's more sort of more for this Pacific region, more based in Australia, and more links to net, I guess. Is that true? Cheers, thanks.
Thank you, William. Do you have anything to add? Okay. Jared, I'll just come around to you. I know this is going to be good.
Just that the merger of the two media organisations raises really important questions. We're seeing the change in scale globally and the dominance of new media and social media. Until we get serious about the nature of that media and nature of content, we really have our hands tied. So as you've said, the Facebook feeds and the YouTube feeds will provide almost no coverage of topics in New Zealand, news which is important. News which is important for everybody's responsibility as a voter, in local body elections, Jim, and in national politics. So all the discussions of things which are important, which we should have some consideration of, are being banished. So the Commerce Commission has acted as de facto, at the moment, the preliminary ruling, and protecting those interests. But until we're much clearer about that vacuum which is being formed and the inadequacy of the private alternatives, we will be limited in the effect we have.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and returns to that earlier comment I made. No one else is going to tell our story. Facebook's not going to create that content. If we want to do it, we've got to do it ourselves. And you raised the Commerce Commission as well, and we're unique again in this respect that our commerce law has no specific broadcasting aspects to it. So the Commerce Commission, on considering that application, only looks in terms of the competition, in particular the advertising markets and the impacts there. The irony is that the Australian-owned media company applying for the merger couldn't apply in Australia because they have broadcasting-specific monopoly and competition law, which is another area which we severely lack in New Zealand.
William.
I guess the question we ask is, well, what is the future survival of media? I guess, and maybe on that thought of the media companies and players out there, is do they have anything in their contracts or in their obligations to be there for the citizens of the country or their cultural things they represent? Cheers.
Thank you, William.
Well, the short answer is no. RNZ, though, they have a charter. Māori TV, has their regime they operate under. Everything else is for profit. If you speak to the journalists, they're doing it for the right reasons. These are people wanting to find out and share news about, their country. But there are no specific obligations, for example, on newspapers or, even TVNZ, which I find a tragedy that we've got this national television broadcaster, but with no public broadcasting responsibilities.
Thank you. Is anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. I hope you will sign and share the petition, and I'll keep you posted on what's happening next. If you want to sign the email register, I'll keep you up to date that way as well. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming out on Anniversary Day. I really appreciate it. It's great to see so many people who care about public broadcasting. We'll keep up the fight, definitely. And thank you to Gareth Hughes, Green Party MP and Broadcasting Spokesperson. Is there anything you'd like to say as a closing remark? Okay. Thank you.